Okay, so I'm Ben Etheridge. I'm going to talk about the economics of inequality. So first of all, a bit about me. As I said, my name is Ben Etheridge. I've taught at Essex since 2011, 9 years now, and I'm a lecturer in economics and a director of the postgraduate courses. Okay, so I'm going to talk about economic inequality. So I'm going to start with a very bold statement, and that is that inequality is increasing and it's an intensifying social policy problem. Okay, so as I'm going to say in the next 20 minutes, inequality is a very hard thing to pin down. I would call it a bit of a mystery. I'm going to start with that bold statement and then kind of elaborate on it for a little bit for the next 20 minutes. So one thing I can say for sure is that inequality is a broad issue. It spans economics, sociology, all of social science really, political science, philosophy. So today we're just going to look at a few aspects, a very, very small fraction of this topic, some aspects, and see what economics has to say and has said in the last 10, 20 years. Well, let's first of all think about inequality as a social policy problem. So I want to compare it briefly to other big policy problems. So for example, climate change, which up to a couple of months ago, we might have thought of as the kind of most immediate and urgent big social policy problem. And in the last couple of months, obviously pandemics have raised their head as a thing for society to deal with. Well, the science of climate change and pandemics may be difficult, but in terms of social policy, they're comparatively simple. And the main challenge for tackling, say, climate change is to coordinate action. So we know we need to eliminate greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And the question is, how do we coordinate to kind of do that? Inequality is a lot more of a mystery, and people have debated it for at least the last 200 years and not really come up with many solutions. And as a topic, it has many aspects. So let's think about some questions about inequality. So remember that bold statement I said on the first slide. I said inequality is increasing and it's an intensifying social policy problem. Well, people might even debate whether it really is a problem. So is inequality always bad? I mean, that's a big topic for philosophers as well as economists that people have argued over for hundreds of years. And I think economists would agree that there are some positive aspects to inequalities, but I'm going to skip over this today and argue that there are lots of very bad and pernicious aspects to increasing inequality. Secondly, again, that first statement I said, inequality is increasing. Well, that's something I'm going to focus on today for the next 15, 20 minutes and show you that even measuring inequalities is actually very, very hard. And so as you know, economists are quantitative social science researchers, and that's something we can really contribute to and try and pin down. And then finally, if we think that increasing inequalities is a bad thing and a big social policy problem, then the question is, how do we reduce inequalities? And that's a debate going back to at least Marx, who had strong opinions about this. And again, is something that we really know very little about and is really a hard problem to solve. Okay, so I said that I'm going to focus mainly on measuring inequality, which is slightly the mundane part of the problem. But to engage with debates, we really have to measure the problem properly. And so people have very strong political views on inequality without really knowing what's happening in the real world. And so it's a slightly mundane challenge to measure inequality, but it turns out to be very, very hard. And even today, researchers debate the basic numbers. So I'm going to give you an example by looking at one aspect of inequality, which has been very influential, which is what's called top shares. So this is the share of economic resources going to the top 1%, top 0.1%, that's the top 1 in 1,000 individuals or households. So these numbers have been particularly influential over the last 10 to 20 years. And they've been, for example, they've contributed to the Occupy movement. So an Occupy movement was a big public campaign, say 5 years ago, which campaigned about the increasing share of resources going to the top 1%. But it turns out that even these numbers are kind of contested. So I'm going to show you an example of some of this research, some of these numbers on inequality. So this is evidence on increasing wealth shares in the United States for the last 100 years, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And this is from two prominent scholars, Emmanuel Sayers and Gabriel Zuckman. So this is the share of total household wealth in the United States being owned by the top 0.1%, that's top 1 in 1,000 households. So it goes back to 1913, going to 2013. So when you see more of these kind of pictures, you'll see a familiar pattern, which is this familiar U shape. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there was lots of inequality, so that really the richest people owned a lot of national wealth. And then we had this broad compression, expanding middle class. And then since the 1970s, we've seen this increasing inequality, this increasing share of national wealth going to the top. Here it's 0.1% of households. So going in a bit more detail, well, first of all, looking at the scale of, on the vertical axis, we can see the scale of inequality according to this measure. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the top 1 in 1,000 households owned around a quarter, 25% of total wealth in the United States. Obviously that went down to kind of under 10% in the late 60s, early 70s, and has gone back again to around about a quarter or kind of a bit over a fifth. So in that we see, well, I won't kind of elaborate in too much detail, but we see some kind of movements according to big macro events. So in the first half of the 20th century, obviously we had some world wars, we had the Roaring '20s, we had a Great Depression. Since the Second World War, we had this great kind of convergence in this so-called golden period of economic growth up to the 1970s. But then since the 1970s, for some reason, there's been this divergence as top households have pulled away. There's been a few episodes in those last 50 years where this increasing inequality has been reversed. So for example, around the year 2000, there was a crashing of the dot-com bubble, which you can see lowered wealth for the top 0.1%, but really it has been rising inexorably upwards for the last 50 years. Okay, before I move on, let's think about why you might contest some of these numbers. Well, it turns out this is a very hard thing to measure, the top shares, because these top households are actually quite hard to pin down. So these top 1 in 1,000 households will include people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, these really, really rich people. And if you go and knock on their door and ask them, you know, how much money they have, they don't tend to answer, they don't tend to pick up the phone. It's even quite hard to define where they live. So lots of these really rich people, well, they might be defined as living in the United States, but they might spend lots of their time living internationally, living in other countries too. So measuring their wealth is a real challenge, and there's a substantial number of researchers who devote their time to trying to pin down how much of these really rich people really own. Okay, so I'm going to show you a more recent picture by other scholars, which kind of contests some of those numbers. So now I'm going to show you slightly different. I'm going to show you, well, again, just now for the last 50 years, going back to 1960, last 60 years. And now I'm going to show you income as opposed to wealth. Just for convenience, these are data that I was reading about recently. Okay, so we see something similar with the gray line, which is by Emmanuel Sayers again, the same scholar as in the previous picture, alongside Thomas Piketty, who you may have heard of. And we see a kind of similar type numbers. So this is now the top 1%, the top 1 in 100 individuals now and their incomes. And we see that in the 1960s and 70s, those top 1% earned only around 10%, or well, still a lot, but 10% of national income. Since then, that share has risen according to Piketty Sayers, and they now earn around 20–25% of national income. So that's the really kind of rich business owners, people with extremely high income, people who work in Well, this is the US, so people who work in Wall Street, financiers in New York. However, other scholars, for example, Alton and Splinter, who have looked in these data in more detail and produced the black line, they argue that there has been some increasing top share, so some increase in inequality, but it's been much more moderate than Piketty and Saez have claimed. So on their measure, and they look at the data in slightly different ways, they argue that the share going to the top 1% has increased to only about 12 or 13%, so much less. And according to their numbers, you know, the Occupy movement really doesn't have much of a basis to have a public protest. Okay, so we could debate these things for hours, for years, but I'll just show you some bit more evidence and I'll kind of come down on one side. So is inequality really increasing? What other measures do indicate that inequality has really increased in the last 50 or 60 years? So I'm finally going to show you a picture which shows inequality at a different part of the distribution, which is the ratio between middle earners, people who earn exactly in the middle of the distribution, the ratio between them and people who earn at the 90th percentile. So not the top 1%, but those people who earn more than 90% of other workers, but less than 10% of other workers. So they might be head teachers in schools, doctors, that kind of thing, not senior doctors, but doctors, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, these people are much easier to measure because they do live in defined addresses. They do tend to answer surveys. They do pick up the phone if you phone them up and ask how much they earn, in contrast to Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. Okay, so this is for the US as well. And this shows the ratio of, again, going back to the 1970s. And this shows the ratio, and this distinguishes between men and women in this picture. This shows the ratio of earnings for someone at the 90th percentile compared to someone at the middle. So in 1973, someone at the 90th percentile earned 1.8 times a person at the middle, so 80% more. So if someone in the middle earned $30,000, then that person at the 90th percentile earned around $50,000. But that ratio has increased steadily. Up to 2011, the ratio was 2.4. So now that person at the 90th percentile is earning 140% more than the person at the median. So if the person at the median is earning $30,000, the equivalent for the 90th percentile would be like $75,000. So a big increase in inequality according to that measure. Okay, so that was just a brief introduction to some of the numbers. I said that just measuring inequality is a hard challenge and people have debated this for decades. But let's move on to more substantive debates and think about what do we do about inequality if we agree that increasing inequality is a social policy problem. Well, if you have any ideas, then please let us know. I think recently, much attention, so there's attention on various aspects of inequality, but a lot of attention is focused on child environment and inequalities kind of going back to child situations. So the numbers I've shown you have been for adults, some adults earning or having much more wealth than other adults. But the argument here is if you want to solve or soften adult inequality, really the place to do this is to invest in children more, because there's a lot of inequality in the circumstances in which children are raised. So the idea is that bottom inequality or poverty, and I've shown you pictures mainly for top inequality, but here we're thinking of bottom end inequality. So the idea is that a lot of bottom end inequality is caused by difficult upbringings. Okay, so it's well known that parental background affects children's life chances. And I'm going to show you a bit of recent research on that in a moment. So there are various reasons for this. As I said, inequality is such a broad area. There are so many ways in which children are disadvantaged, both nature, and there's debates going back to nature and nurture. And recent important evidence shows that not just parental kind of background, where parental background is important for children's outcomes, but also the place that children are born. And this has been a kind of influential evidence in the last 5 or 10 years has emphasized really effects of place. So I'm going to show you one last piece of evidence which shows you something slightly different to what I've shown before and shows an important aspect of inequality if we're going to look at it in more detail, which is income mobility. And I'm going to show you for a couple of different places, again, evidence from the United States. Okay, so I'll explain this graph in a bit of detail to show you what's going on here. So in the horizontal axis along the bottom, we have the parent rank in the national income distribution. So we take, say, 100 adults, parents, and we rate them from the poorest at the left-hand side to the richest on the right-hand side, okay? So we've got the 20 going 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 10, 100 will be the ordering of 100 parents. And then on the vertical axis, we have evidence on what's the expected or average attainment of those parents' children, okay? So right at the top, for parents who are at the top of the income distribution, on average, their children will also be above average when they become grown-ups, okay? So their children, if we look at the vertical axis, will be at the 65th percentile on average. So for parents who are at the top of the income distribution, their children would expect to earn more than 65% of other adults when they become adults and be poorer on average than 35%. Okay, so it's not the case that the children of the top absolute richest people will always be the richest people when they're adults, but they tend to be better than average or do better than average. Okay, so if we go down to the left-hand side, so look at the children of the poorest adults. So on the left-hand side of the graph, here now we see that the children of those parents, when they turn out to be adults, they now turn out to be poorer typically than average. But here we see a difference by place. And so the authors of this study, a famous study from about 5 years ago, just bring up 2 different cities, and I'll talk a little bit about what might be different about these cities in a moment. So they talk about Salt Lake City and Charlotte, Charlotte's a city on the east coast of America, in North Carolina, I believe. Okay, so if we look at Salt Lake City, which is the top line, so for the poorest adults in Salt Lake City, their children, they end up being a bit poorer than average, but not substantially poorer than average. So they end up at the kind of 40th percentile. So poorer than 60% of people when they grow up to be adults, but richer than, on average, 40% of people. But if we look at Charlotte, which is the bottom line, so the children of really poor parents in Charlotte, well, they turn out to do substantially worse than average. So they turn out to be, on average, only at the 25th percentile, so poorer than 75% of other people. So those children when they turn out to be adults. So what do we take from this picture? Well, 2 things. First of all, that parental background has a big effect on children's outcomes. So if we want to look at, and that's both in Salt Lake City and in Charlotte. So if we want to improve some inequalities and ameliorate poverty at the bottom end, we might want to think about policies to improve the home environment for children with poorer parental backgrounds. But also there's a big effect of cities. So children who grow up poor in Salt Lake City turn out to do much better than children who grow up poor in Charlotte. And I haven't got time to talk about this, but the authors suggest this is something where policies really can have a difference. So what makes Charlotte different from Salt Lake City is Charlotte has much bigger racial segregation. It has lower social cohesion. And Salt Lake City may have better public infrastructure, better schools that really help poorer children who grow up there. Okay, so I'm going to round up And just think about how economists study inequality. So I've given you a couple of tasters, but I want to go a bit broader and think more broadly about what economists have to say about inequality. So the topic of inequality is vast, but economists do contribute a lot. So thinking a bit more abstractly, and I'm probably going in and kind of becoming a bit too kind of technical for a kind of introductory talk, but much of inequality comes from prices. So you might want to think about holding a degree, the price of holding a degree, which turns to college. So it turns out a lot of increase in inequality over the last 50 years because degree holders start earning a lot more than non-degree holders. And another reason why there's inequality in living standards because of big increases in house prices. So economists have a lot to say about understanding about why these prices change. Other sources of inequalities are differences in individual traits. Okay, so these often reflect choices such as investments in skills. So some people have lots of skills in jobs, other people have less skills in jobs. And some of these are about investments that people make or their parents make in them as their children. So economists can study these too. Another big source of inequality is luck, such as on the job market. So people graduating from university this year will unfortunately be very unlucky in that they're going to be, suffer in the job market in the autumn. And economists, we know that this bad luck does persist for a long time into people's careers. So economists study how this luck kind of manifests itself in the job market. And as I've argued already, economists have a key eye for the data to measure inequality. Okay, so here are some takeaways. So increasing inequality is an important social policy problem. Economists debate many aspects of it, even the extent of the problem itself. And economists investigate the cause of inequalities. And while I haven't talked about this, but economists investigate the consequences as well in many ways. Okay, so that's just a very brief discussion of aspects of economic inequality. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you have.